in any case. Now, so we have this new country called Bangladesh in 1971. And this country called Bangladesh is extremely heavily populated. I think it's easy to say it's overpopulated. I won't define to you what overpopulation is because it's disputed what that is. All right, it's not so easy to define exactly what overpopulation is. But I would say by any measure, Bangladesh is considered overpopulated. All right, somebody can type into the web what the population of Bangladesh is. It's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood at this particular time, about 165 million, somewhere about in there. All right, meaning that Bangladesh, more or less, is the 7th largest country in the world. All right, I believe it's slightly larger than Russia. Russia, which is 1/8 of the land on the planet. All right, roughly speaking, Bangladesh is bigger. And it means in a country, Bangladesh is a country which is about half the size of the state of Texas. But this country has half the population of the United States within it. Thus, you can see it has a very high population density. Now, let's talk about some factors associated with this and move out of the subcontinent. You can see that Bangladesh here is a country essentially that is the, if you would, the delta for two major rivers. You have the Ganges River coming in from India over here. You can see it coming in, and the Brahmaputra River coming from the north, also from India, from the north. And they come together, and where they come together essentially is Bangladesh. The country is located all around the confluence of these two rivers. Thus, it's a deltaic plain. And what I'm saying is it's fairly low-lying. These are soils that would have been brought primarily down from the river systems and have been laid over the millennia in this area. It's a pretty low-lying country. All right, I believe that roughly speaking, most of the country is scarcely over 10 feet above sea level. And by and large, oddly enough, this country the soils are relatively fertile. And by the way, this is a heavily, a subtropical area, a substantial amount of forest. And generally speaking, when you see dense subtropical forests, usually the soil quality is fairly low because most of the nutrients are in the trees, and the remaining nutrients in the land degrade rapidly because you have heat and moisture, and they degrade rapidly in a process called leaching. All right? And generally, that's the case when you see subtropical and tropical rainforests. The soil quality is low. But here the soil quality is high. All right? The land is quite fertile. And the reason why it remains fairly high, arguably you know that since it's able to sustain historically those dense populations, is because, as you can see here, you can see that the Ganges River and the Brahmaputra rivers bring down, if you would, topsoil, if you want to say fertilizer, for you to do so, along with the pollutants, of course, I already talked about. But historically, those soils are brought down by the river system. They come down, heading to the delta, and during flood season, it floods, and so you have a redistribution, a rejuvenation of soil historically, making the delta fairly fertile. Again, you have to add in the 20th century, that means heavy pollution as well. But you understand that in the United States, the Mississippi River is called the Big Muddy. Why? Because it's often carrying off topsoil, valuable topsoil, that's been washed off of the surface of tributary regions upriver, and thus, therefore, it brings that soil down, and it brings down to Louisiana, and therefore you have the growth of that delta down there, sticking slowly out into the Caribbean. Of course, I won't talk about the Atchafalaya Tract and how New Orleans is slowly being cut off from that historical flow. In fact, it is cut off. Let's leave that to another day. You understand why this remains fairly fertile land despite the problematic pollutants. Now, you have a heavily populated country over here that's fairly low-lying, close to sea level. You can see the river systems coming in, the Brahmaputra here and the Ganges over here, and you can see how they're brown, they're carrying silt, and that silt is being brought, that topsoil is being brought down over here, and of course it precipitates out when it reaches grade, if you would, over here, and in fact builds all, this is all new land over here. All right, all being built up by the soils being deposited. In fact, what's going to happen is as some of these deltaic islands congeal and get stabilized, crops or plants, I should say, start to grow on them, holding the soil down, and this becomes viable land over time. And you know what's going to happen in a heavily populated country when new land pops up. You're going to get people from the other areas of the country to go out onto that land and start practicing agriculture because it becomes viable. In fact, you can see this is a false color infrared image. In effect, red means heavy green. And you can see these areas slowly being co-opted by agricultural production. In a country that's impoverished, high population densities, this represents an opportunity. Okay? Now, this has implications, unfortunately, in the modern era for Bangladesh, that it is at the end of this watershed delivery zone. That you get countries like Nepal, which is upstream. And if you look at Nepal, all right, it is essentially the southern flank of the Himalayas. And what happens is you're seeing substantial amount of deforestation in Nepal. Been going on for decades now. People chopping down wood or trees to use for fuel and also to clear the land to run goats and other animals. And what happens when you chop down the trees is that now you do not have the root system of those trees to hold the soil down. And so what happens is that soil now is more easily runs off, heading down into the Ganges, and then ultimately heading to Bangladesh. And you might think, well, that's good for Bangladesh. You might think, because of the fertile soils. Well, it's more complicated than that. All right. You can see here where these rivers upstream in the Ganges become congested, heavily sedimented. And this produces, if you would, flooding, because once the river channel begins to get flooded with silt, what that's going to do is it reduces the river channel's capacity to carry water. All right? What that means is you're going to have more flooding events upstream and downstream, and the intensity of the floods is going to increase, since the river can increasingly hold less and less water, as is indicated here by that slide. You can sort of see that here in this image here. This is an image of upstream Ganges in India, and the different colors showing you areas of recent flooding. This is a 2004 image. All right, these areas in blue, as you can see when you look up over here, are areas that flooded before, previous to that, and these areas are subject to flooding because of the heavy deforestation. You would have flooding here anyway, by the way, with the monsoon rains, but the deforestation contributing soil into the river system, congesting the river system, only increases that. Only increases that. Substantial problem. What that means downstream is that Bangladesh is subject, in fact, I suspect no country on earth surpasses it, is subject to extreme flooding events. All right? And yes, this rejuvenates soil, but of course it causes a lot of destruction at the same time. All right? You can see some images here of frequent flooding in Bangladesh, and you can imply the difficulties that this means for the Bengal population, if you would. Now, that's not only the only contributor to flooding here in Bangladesh. As you can see here, 5 to 10 tropical storms come up the Bay of Bengal here a year. And so what happens is you get tropical storms coming up here, as is indicated by this, is obviously a tropical storm that came up the Bay of Bengal over here. And what happens is the very triangular shape that you can see of the Bay of Bengal concentrates the flood impact and brings it right into Bangladesh. In fact, what these tropical storms do when they're coming up here, they're pushing a bunch of water ahead of them called the storm surge. All right, they're pushing a big quantity of water ahead of the storm. And of course, the triangular shape of the Bay of Bengal concentrates that impact right where Bangladesh is located. All right, so you get this massive storm surge. In fact, you can see an image here, all right, showing you the extent to which the storm surge extends inland. In fact, you can see these areas over here, areas affected by the storm surge, areas affected by cyclones. And so what happens is a tropical storm is coming. It's pushing a storm surge up here. It impacts into Bangladesh, extending deep into the country, up near the capital. Here's Dhaka, located right over here. All right, and so people all of a sudden get hit by the storm surge. Remember, these are dense populations, often living at sea level, so it's a dramatic impact. Then they get heavily rained upon directly by the storm. Then the storm proceeds inland, all right, dumping water into the river system and filling the river channels of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra to impressive extents. And then, of course, the storm erodes the southern flank of the Himalayas, exposed soils caused by deforestation, causing yet more silt into the river system, therefore aggravating the flooding downstream even more so. Thus, you understand why Bangladesh suffered the most natural hazards and most deaths from natural hazards in the 20th century, all right, because of this factor, that you have a very large population density living at low elevation, subject to flooding. You can understand how Bangladesh would love to have an effective emergency flood control system, which is difficult to have in an undeveloped country because of these factors. In any case, one storm in 1970 cost upwards of 300,000 lives. So we may get hit in the United States and certainly in, say, Florida by a hurricane, a tropical storm, and it may cause 50 deaths, and that's tragic, of course. But the same storm hitting in Bangladesh might cause hundreds of thousands of deaths. 300,000 lives were lost in 1970. In 1991, 150,000 people were killed. And not simply from drowning, that's too simplistic, but all the associated grief associated with flooding. That means snake bites. That means cholera outbreaks. That means health care services, which cannot get to the populations that need them. All right, it's rather problematic. As I mentioned, it's commonly recognized that 8 out of the 10 costliest natural disasters of the 20th century, that's in terms of mortality, occurred in Bangladesh. All right then. I'm going to end with the Asian subcontinent there. There's much more to talk about, but this is a general survey class, and I have to move along. We cannot cover all countries, which is not reflective of where they deserve to be covered. I wish I had more time to talk about some interesting observations about Bhutan, Sri Lanka, but I got to move along. So we're going to end the Asian subcontinent there.